The Mist of Millbrook, a story by Carl Otto. Maggie Wilson stood at the library's front desk, watching the late October sun cast long shadows across Main Street. The air buzzed with excitement as the small town of Millbroke prepared for its annual Halloween festival. Pumpkins grinned from every porch, and fake cobwebs stretched between lampposts, swaying gently in the crisp autumn breeze. "Mom, can I go help set up the haunted house?" Mike asked, already halfway to the door. Maggie raised an eyebrow. "Weren't you supposed to be finishing your costume first?" Mike turned, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Well, I figured I'd go as a procrastinating teenager. You know, last-minute costume, bedhead, the works. It's called method acting, Mom." Maggie chuckled despite herself. "Very funny, mister. Just be back by 6, okay?" "You got it," Mike called over his shoulder, already darting out the door. As Mike darted out, the library door creaked open. Mrs. Abernathy shuffled in, her silver hair neatly pinned back, a weathered leather-bound book clutched to her chest. The elderly woman had been a fixture in Millbrook for as long as anyone could remember her small antiquarian bookshop, a treasure trove of forgotten lore and dusty tomes. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Abernathy." Maggie greeted the elderly lady with genuine affection. "Here for your usual Halloween read?" The old woman's eyes twinkled with an inscrutable light. "Oh yes, dear. All Hallows' Eve isn't complete without a good spine chiller." She approached the desk, her movements slow but purposeful. "Though I dare say, the stories in these books pale in comparison to the real mysteries that surround us." Maggie leaned in, intrigued. Mrs. Abernathy had a way of making even the most mundane conversation feel like a prelude to some grand revelation. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Abernathy glanced around, as if checking for eavesdroppers in the empty library. "Have you ever noticed how the veil between worlds seems thinnest on Halloween? It's not just superstition, you know. This town, it has secrets, old secrets." Before Maggie could probe further, the library door burst open again. Sheriff Frank Tanner strode in, his usually jovial face creased with concern. "Sarah, have you seen the weather report? There's some kind of freak fog rolling in from the lake." Maggie frowned. "Fog? But it's been clear all day." "I know, it's the damnedest thing. Started about an hour ago, and it's getting thicker by the minute. I'm thinking we might have to cancel the festival if it doesn't clear up." Mrs. Abernathy's grip on her book tightened, her knuckles turning white. "Fog, you say?" Her voice had lost its storyteller's lilt, taking on a sharp, almost fearful edge. "From the lake?" Frank nodded, giving the old woman a curious look. "That's right, Mrs. A. Why, does that mean something to you?" For a moment, Mrs. Abernathy seemed to age before their eyes, the weight of some unspoken burden settling on her shoulders. But then she shook her head, the moment passing. "Oh, it's just an old woman's fancies. Don't mind me, but perhaps it would be wise to bring people indoors, Sheriff, just in case." Frank scratched his head. "Well, I was thinking of suggesting folks stay home, but that might be an overreaction. It's just fog after all." Maggie moved to the window, peering out at the steadily darkening sky. A chill ran down her spine as she saw the mist for a tendril-like mass creeping down Main Street with an unnatural yellowish tinge. "I don't know, Frank. Something about this doesn't feel right." Maggie, Frank, and Mrs. Abernathy stood by the window, watching as the unnatural fog crept down Main Street. Other library patrons began to gather around them, their faces a mix of curiosity and growing concern. "I've never seen anything like it," whispered Jenny, Maggie's young assistant. "It's like the fog has a mind of its own." Frank nodded grimly. "It's moving against the wind. That's not natural." As they discussed the approaching fog, Mrs. Abernathy clutched her book tighter, her knuckles whitening. "History has a way of repeating itself," she murmured, more to herself than to Maggie. "And some wounds never truly heal." They watched as the mist engulfed cars and street lamps, muffling sounds and distorting familiar shapes. A dog barked in the distance, the sound oddly warped and fading quickly. "Look!" cried Mr. Thompson, pointing towards the town square. "What's happening to the statue?" The fog had reached the bronze statue of the town founder. As it swirled around the monument, the metal seemed to ripple and warp, the figure's features twisting into an agonized grimace before being swallowed completely by the mist. Mrs. Abernathy's hand tightened on her book. "It's starting," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Suddenly, the library door burst open. Two men stumbled in, supporting a third with a bloody, torn leg. "Something attacked us in the fog," one gasped. Frank helped lower the injured man onto a chair. "What happened?" "We were in the park when the fog rolled in," the second man explained, his eyes wide. "We heard whispers. Ain't no language I ever heard. The paths kept changing, and then this thing appeared." The injured, pale-faced man muttered, "Not human. Too many limbs and eyes. Tentacles. That's when it got his leg," the first man added. "We managed to pull him away and ran. Somehow, we ended up here." Mrs. Abernathy stepped forward, her face grave. "It's worse than I feared," she said. "The veil is thinning faster this time. We have to do something." Before anyone could question her, a child's scream pierced the air outside, quickly swallowed by the fog. Maggie's blood ran cold. "Mike," she whispered, panic rising. "He's out there." Maggie bolted for the door. "Mike's out there. I have to find him." Frank caught her arm, his face a mask of concern and professional duty. "Maggie, wait. We can't just rush out there. It's not safe. That's my son, Frank." Maggie's voice cracked with desperation. Frank looked around the room, taking in the frightened faces of the townsfolk who had sought refuge in the library. He was responsible for all of them, but he also knew the anguish of a parent fearing for their child. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice. "I understand, I do. But I can't let you go out there alone. And I can't leave these people unprotected." Mrs. Abernathy stepped forward. "Sheriff, if I may, you're right to be cautious, but we can't abandon the boy. Perhaps a small group could go while you organize things here?" Frank hesitated, weighing his options. Finally, he nodded. "All right, here's what we'll do. Maggie, you and I will go look for Mike. Mrs. Abernathy, you seem to know something about what's happening. Will you come with us?" The old woman nodded solemnly. Frank turned to address the room. "Jenny, you're in charge here. Lock the doors. Don't let anyone in unless you're absolutely sure it's safe. Mr. Thompson, you've got hunting experience, right? You keep everyone safe. Everyone else, stay calm and stay together." He faced Maggie and Mrs. Abernathy. "We go out, we find Mike, and we come straight back. No heroics, no detours. Understood?" Maggie nodded, relief and determination mingling on her face. "Okay, let's move," Frank said, checking his gun. "And everyone, be careful. We don't know what we're facing." Maggie nodded, relief flooding her face. She turned to Mrs. Abernathy. "Are you sure you'll be okay to come with us?" The old woman hesitated, fear and something else, guilt, flashing across her face. But then she squared her shoulders. Yes, I'll come. Perhaps this time I can make it right." As they gathered supplies and prepared to venture into the mist, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into something far beyond their understanding. She thought of Mike, alone and scared in that unnatural fog, and steeled herself for whatever lay ahead. With a last look at the frightened faces of those left behind, Maggie, Frank, and Mrs. Abernathy stepped out into the swirling yellow mist. The fog seemed to reach for them, tendrils curling around their ankles as the library door swung shut behind them with a final sounding click. "Stay close," Frank muttered, his flashlight beam cutting a weak path through the murk. "And keep your eyes open for anything unusual." They moved slowly down Main Street, the familiar storefronts and Halloween decorations taking on a sinister air in the sickly yellow haze. The silence was oppressive, broken only by their footsteps and the occasional distant, muffled sound that might have been a voice, or something else entirely. "Mike?" Maggie called out, her voice sounding flat and lifeless in the dense air. "Mike, where are you?" Mrs. Abernathy placed a wrinkled hand on Maggie's arm. "Careful, dear, we don't know what might answer." As they pressed on, the fog seemed to thicken, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. Shapes moved at the edge of their vision, always disappearing when looked at directly. "Mrs. Abernathy," Frank said, his voice low, "you said this happened before. What exactly did people see back then?" The old woman turned her eyes distant. "Over 50 years ago," she began, but then stopped, shaking her head. "No, you wouldn't believe me. Nobody does." Frank stepped closer, his voice low and urgent. "Mrs. Abernathy, we've got people out here in a fog that's acting like something out of a cheap horror movie. At this point, I'm willing to believe just about anything." Mrs. Abernathy sighed, suddenly looking every one of her years. "It came before when I was young. People disappeared. Things happened. Things that don't make sense in the light of day." "What kind of things?" Maggie pressed. "Time bent. People saw things. Other things. Things that should not be." Mrs. Abernathy's voice dropped to a whisper. "We thought we stopped it. I thought. But it's back, and it's stronger." Maggie caught Mrs. Abernathy's arm as the old woman swayed, looking faint. "Are you all right?" The old woman was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant. "It was 55 years ago. It started much like this," she finally said. "The fog rolled in, and people got lost. But then the visions began." Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. "Visions?" Mrs. Abernathy nodded. "People saw things. Impossible things. Loved ones long dead, walking and talking as if they were alive. Glimpses of other times, other places. Some claimed they saw things that shouldn't exist. There was an old woman too," Mrs. Abernathy added, her voice barely above a whisper. "She came out of the fog, raving about things to come. We thought she was mad, but now I wonder." Frank's grip tightened on his flashlight. "What happened to those people?" "Some died," Mrs. Abernathy whispered. "Others were found wandering, injured, and babbling about monsters and demons. And some came back changed. They were never quite right after that." Maggie swallowed hard, trying to push away thoughts of what Mike might be experiencing. "And the old woman you mentioned? The one who came out of the fog?" Mrs. Abernathy's face twisted with an emotion Maggie couldn't quite name. "Ah, yes, her. No one knew where she came from. She just appeared that night, in the thick of it all. She was raving about closing it and preventing catastrophes. Everyone thought she was mad and even dangerous." "What happened to her?" Frank asked. "She disappeared back into the fog," Mrs. Abernathy said softly. "But she tried to warn us. She said it would all happen again, that we had to be ready." As Mrs. Abernathy spoke, the fog around them seemed to pulse and shift. Shadows deepened, taking on strange, angular shapes that hurt the eyes to look at directly. In the distance, something that might have been a scream echoed, cut off abruptly. "Look!" Maggie gasped, pointing. In the mist ahead, a figure was taking shape. It was hard to make out at first, but as it solidified, Maggie felt her heart stop. It was Mike, standing still and silent, his back to them.